Alan, thank you. It is 25 to 8 now. Let's turn to that new official advice for parents about their children's screen time. Children under 2 should not have any time watching a screen on their own. Under 5 should be limited to an hour a day. That at least is what the officials, ministers at the Department for Education in Westminster are telling parents in England. But what's the basis for that advice, and will parents pay any attention to it? We're going to hear from one of those who helped to develop it, a child psychologist, in a moment, from the minister in charge after 8 o'clock. But first, our senior education reporter, Vanessa Clark, has been following one family in Manchester in their quest to cut down the screen time.
That's my cat.
Yeah, but that's why.
So my name's Alexis, and we've got 2 boys. Romy, who's nearly 5, and Marlowe is nearly 2 in May. So
it's a busy house.
Yeah, it's mad.
Only allowed to use.
For the Montastier family, who live here in Manchester, life is a juggle.
Is there any plane?
From school and nursery pickup to dinner time.
Maybe mac and cheese or something.
Their home is filled with technology, and screen time is something that happens more often than the family would like.
Yeah, it does make me feel guilty for doing it, and I always feel like it's not what we should be doing, but what are you going to do? You're not going to be always getting out of bed, bouncing with them at 6 o'clock and setting up an art and crafts table.
Do you think you do have screens and games on too much? Are you conscious of it, or do you think
I
you're
am
the right
conscious, for sure. It's on my mind every day, but at the same time, it's just like you've got other pressures, and most of the time it is to avoid conflicts, meltdowns, and to give yourself a bit of a break.
No, I need to recite some.
Over the next week, the Montastiers are keen to cut back on screen time, swapping mobile devices and TV for books, toys and other activities.
All you have is an iPad.
And for Romy, it is going to be a big change.
What do you do with your iPad?
I like to do Angry Birds games. And there's a big pig tower where all the pigs are, and then there's the thing where there's this.
1 week later, I check back in to see how they've been getting on.
So yeah, it's been interesting, to say the least. At the start of the week, I was like, yeah, come on, we're going to do this. And by the end of the week, no screen, or everything will just swap perfectly. But it didn't happen. We've tried our best, but I think, I've been conscious of it for a while. This has definitely made me more aware and almost made me start doing things that I've always said, we need to do that.
For Romy, I'm not sure he's totally convinced, but there were definitely some highlights.
Dancing in the morning.
Was that better than the iPad?
Yes.
Took a bit of time for Romy to answer that question from our education reporter, Vanessa Clark there. Let's turn to Professor Sam Wass, Director of the Institute for the Science of Early Years and one of the UK's leading experts on early year brain development. Good morning to you, Professor Wass.
Morning, Nick.
It was very telling, wasn't it, the words of that mother? Been interesting, we've tried our best. This is a real struggle for parents.
It is, and it's something where, parenting has just changed so fast, so rapidly. When I was a child, television was accessible in the living room, but it was only on for certain hours of the day. Whereas now, since we've had kind of TV, iPads being widespread, we've had, the massive increase, more than doubling in the last 15 years of the amount of screen time. And they're really high levels nowadays. So a recent DFE study found that the average 2-year-old watches about 2 hours, 10 minutes per day, with the top 20%. So that's 150,000 2-year-olds watching an average of 5 hours a day of content. So, it's so convenient and it's so ingrained in our lives now, but these changes have happened so fast that, frankly, when we've been putting together the guidance, we've reviewed the evidence very, very carefully for what there is, but we're frankly an area where the science is struggling to keep up just with the rate of change.
Well, tell us what the science does tell us, because it's not just how much is watched for how long, but what is watched.
Yeah, definitely. That's coming through really strongly. And that's one thing that we do know, which is that the needs of young brains are very different to the needs of older children. So, basically our brains are prediction machines. So we're constantly trying to guess what we're going to see or hear next before we see it or hear it. And that helps us to perceive things. And young brains don't have so much prior experience, so they can't predict so well what they're going to see or hear next, which makes them much slower and much less efficient. And we know that when they're in a situation where they can't predict what's going to happen next, when they're overwhelmed, then we go into this kind of high alert mode, fight or flight, which, I'd say is probably why you get these links between screens and behavioural dysregulation are coming through so strongly from the research. So So there are some really, really interesting areas here. I mean, frankly, Nick, there's one thing that puzzles me. I do a lot of research into this, is the bit that we really don't understand is why children are so drawn to screens. So we know that screens aren't as effective for early learning as face-to-face interaction. And, as I've been saying, we know that they cause stress, they cause this fight or flight response. But what we don't understand is why children are so drawn to them. And that's the bit that, frankly, we really, really need to figure out.
So in a sense, these guidelines are precautionary because there isn't the evidence there to support a particular number of minutes or hours. There's a bigger question, though, isn't there? What difference will a recommended limit from a government department make? It is not what parents are going to spend much time thinking about, is it?
Yeah, yes, that is true. One of the really interesting things that I reflect on a lot is this idea of, shared engagement. And all of the research into, the effects of parenting on, how best to promote a child's attention is that shared engagement is by far the most effective way to do it. There's some lovely research by my colleague Daniel Matthews at the University of Sheffield with CBeebies that communication interventions are actually more effective during infancy than toddlerhood. And we were saying that maybe that's because early on it's easier to get parents into this habit of, thinking that your child is someone who can be talked to, who, can point out something interesting that you haven't noticed, rather than this trap which we all get into of, sitting, living parallel lives, staring at our individual screens and, occasionally kind of barking out instructions when there's something that we need. So it's a really, really hard to shift these habits. You're absolutely right about
But do you think guidelines make any difference to that, I suppose, is my question. I know you didn't draw up the guidelines your own. You were one of the people who influenced it. But, clearly we get all sorts of advice about what we eat, for example, about the need to wear seatbelts. Some of them effective, like seatbelts, but it's also legally enforced. Arguably 5 a day and so on when it comes to fruit and veg makes not that much difference, does it? Is this really going to affect conversations at home? You can't do it. The government says you can only have an hour a day.
Yeah, well, what we're trying to do is to think about screen swaps. So actually into the guidance, we've put some things about, things you can be, talking about at a mealtime rather than kind of having screens. And the thing that I think is really important here, Nick, is that, shared engagement. I've got 3 young kids and I live a very busy life. And I really, really have to force myself sometimes to, in the morning when you're getting ready, getting everything together and you're in a big hurry, to actually get down on the floor with them and look at the world from their perspective and just be engaged in what they're interested in. And the thing that, I think is really, really important to get across is that this helps your own mental health too. You'll get so caught up in your own worries and your own high-speed, high-paced adult life, that actually to get down and slow yourself down to the pace of a young child, even if it's just for a couple of minutes in the morning, it's very evidence-based that it helps the child, but it also helps you too.
Some help and some support, rather than a series of strict guidelines by the sounds of it. Professor Sam Wass, Director of the Institute for the Science of Early Years, thank you very much indeed. We'll hear from the Minister at about 8:20.